The ship was quiet and cold, and Commander Talvin stood alone on the bridge staring at the stars through the wide observation glass. He had served the Korvathi diplomatic corps for 23 years, and in all that time he had never once been nervous about a mission. But today his four hands would not stop trembling. His second officer Riska walked up behind him and spoke in a low voice. "She is Hera." Talvin turned slowly. His pale blue skin tightened around his jaw the way it always did when he was thinking too hard. He nodded once and walked toward the docking port. The human was already standing inside the airlock waiting. She was not what he expected. Lieutenant Commander Mara Andris was shorter than most Korvathi. Her skin was a warm brown, and her dark hair was pulled back tight against her head. She wore a simple gray uniform with no medals and no weapons. Her hands were clasped behind her back, and her eyes were calm and steady like water that has not been touched by. When she smiled when she saw Talvin and extended one hand. "Commander Talvin, I am honored to be aboard your ship." Her voice was soft, but something in it made Talvin pause. He could not explain it. There was no edge to it, no sharpness, no threat, but his instincts, the deep old ones that had kept his ancestors alive on the frozen plains of Karth, told him to pay attention. He shook her hand carefully. His biometric scanner, a tiny device embedded behind his left ear, automatically logged her vitals. Heart rate, normal temperature, normal muscle density, unremarkable brain activity. Calm, nothing special, and Triska had warned him the night before, standing in the dim light of the officers' quarters with a datapad clutched in all four of her hands. "I have read the classified files on humans," she had said. "The unclassified data is boring on purpose." Talvin had not understood what she meant. He understood even less now as he watched Mara Andris walk through the corridors of his ship, looking at everything with quiet curiosity. She asked about the engine design. She asked about the crew rotation. She asked where she could get coffee. Talvin had repeated, "It is a hot drink," she said. "It helps me think." He had someone bring her a cup of something close enough, and she thanked them with a warmth that made the young Korvathi officer blush 3 shades of violet. The mission was simple, at least on paper. The Korvathi and the Drenvak Dominion had been fighting over a border region for 11 years. Thousands had died on both sides. A peace summit had been arranged on the neutral world of Orith. Prime and both sides had agreed to allow a third-party mediator. The Korvathi had chosen a human. Talvin still did not fully understand why. His superiors had explained it in vague terms. Humans have a record of successful mediation, they said. Conflicts they mediate tend to stay resolved. No one had explained how or why the Drenvak were the real concern. They were an apex predator species. 8 feet tall, armored with natural bone plating across their shoulders and spine. They had 4 eyes that could see in total darkness, and their culture was built entirely around combat and honor. They settled disagreements with blood, and they respected nothing except strengths, sending a small, quiet human woman to stand between them and the Korvathi felt to Talvin like sending a candle into a storm. The journey to Orith Prime would take 6 days and faster than light travel. Talvin expected Mara to spend that time reviewing diplomatic files or resting. Instead, she did something that unsettled him deeply. She trained every morning. She went to the cargo bay, and she ran not fast, but steady. She ran for 2 hours without stopping. Talvin watched on the security feed and noticed that her breathing barely changed. Her heart rate rose and held perfectly flat, like a machine locked into a rhythm. His scanner logged the data and flagged nothing because it did not know what to flag in. The afternoon she studied. She memorized Drenvak cultural protocols, their language, their history, their insults, their sacred gestures. She learned things about the Drenvak that most Korvathi diplomats had never bothered to learn. She asked Riska questions that made the second officer go pale. What is the Drenvak word for a debt that cannot be repaid with money? Riska had stared at her for a long time before answering. In the evenings, Mara sat alone in her quarters and read. She read everything. Old Korvathi poetry, Drenvak war records, trade agreements from the last century. She read them the way a soldier studies a battlefield, not for beauty, but for weakness. On the fourth night, Talvin found himself standing outside her door. He did not know why he had come. He knocked, and she opened it. She was holding a cup of that dark human drink, and her eyes looked tired for the first time. "Can I help you, Commander?" she asked. He opened his mouth and then closed it. What he wanted to ask was what? "Are you really?" But that seemed rude. So instead he asked, "Are you prepared for the summit?" She looked at him for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes, something old and heavy and patient. "I haven't been preparing for this my whole life," she said. It's simply like it was just a fact, like the sky is dark or the ship is moving. But the way she said it made the hair on the back of Talvin's neck stand up in a way he had not felt since the last time he had been in actual danger. He walked back to his quarters and sat in the dark for a long time. On the sixth day, the Velshara dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Arith Prime. The planet was gray and barren and covered in dust storms. A single ancient citadel stood on the surface waiting. Mara stood on the bridge beside Talvin, looking down at the planet. Her face showed nothing. Her heartbeat on his scanner was perfectly steady. Somewhere down there, the Drenvak were already waiting. Talvin glanced at the small human woman beside him, and for the first time, he felt something he could not name. It was not fear exactly. It was the feeling you get when you realize you have been standing next to something powerful, and you did not know it. The ship began its descent, and Mara Andris finished her coffee. The citadel on Arith Prime was ancient beyond counting, built from black stone that absorbed light. It rose from the dust like a broken tooth against the gray sky. Inside, the air was cold and thin, and every sound echoed like a memory that would not die. Talvin walked 3 steps behind Mara as they entered the main hall. His 4 hands were clenched tight inside his diplomatic robes. Across the hall, the Drenvak delegation was already seated. Warlord Keshran sat at the head of their table. He was enormous, even for a Drenvak. He was large, nearly 9 feet of armored bone and dense muscle. His skin was dark like iron left in rain and covered with old scars that he wore like medals. His 4 eyes burned amber in the low light, and when he saw Mara walk in, something shifted in his expression. It was not respect, it was amusement. Leaned toward one of his officers and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is what the Korvathi send. A soft little creature with no claws and no armor. I could break her with 1 finger." His officers laughed. The sound was like rocks grinding together. Talvin felt heat rise in his chest, but Mara did not react at all. She walked to her seat between the 2 delegations, sat down, folded her hands on the table and waited. She did not look at Keshran. She did not look away from him either. She simply existed in the space between both sides like she had always been there. The negotiations began. For the first 2 hours, it was what Talvin expected. Keshran demanded the return of 3 border systems. The Korvathi delegation refused. Keshran accused them of theft. They accused him of aggression. Voices rose, fists hit tables. Mara listened. She did not speak for those entire 2 hours. She just listened and watched, and sometimes she tilted her head slightly to one side, like she was hearing something no one else could hear. Talvin watched her on his scanner. Her heart rate was 58 beats per minute. It did not change. Not once. Then a pause in the shouting. Mara spoke for the first time. "Warlord Keshran," she said, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. Keshran turned all 4 of his eyes on her. "You are not angry about the territory," she said. The hall went silent. Keshran stared at her. His massive jaw tightened, and the bone plates on his shoulders shifted upward, a threat display that usually made other species step back. Mara did not step back. "You lost soldiers," she continued. "Not in the border skirmish, but before that, 17 Drenvak cargo ships were destroyed when the Korvathi broke a trade agreement. 8 years ago, those ships carried medical supplies for your colony on Vreth. 900 civilians died, including children. You are not here for land. You are here because a broken promise killed your people, and no one has ever answered for it. Silence that followed was the loudest thing Talvin had ever heard. Keshran did not move for a long time. His amber eyes were fixed on Mara, and something in them changed. The amusement was gone. Something raw and terrible had taken its place. Talvin looked at his own delegation and saw shock on their faces. Their intelligence corps had buried that trade agreement incident years ago. They thought no one remembered Mara. Remember, Ed Shran spoke, and his voice was different now. Lower, quieter, more dangerous. How do you know this? I read, she said simply. I read everything. The session continued, but the energy in the room had shifted completely. Keshran was no longer performing. He was no longer posturing for his officers. He was looking at Mara with something that might have been the first seed of respect. Buried deep under years of fury during a break, Talvin pulled Mara aside into a corridor. His hands were shaking. How did you know that? He whispered. Our own intelligence missed it entirely. Your intelligence did not miss it, she said. They buried it because it was inconvenient. The truth usually is. He stared at her, and for the first time he noticed something about her eyes. They were brown and warm and completely steady, but behind them was a depth that frightened him. It was like looking into water that seemed shallow until you realized there was no bottom. Asked her the question he had been carrying since she boarded his ship. Are you afraid? She smiled, and it was a real smile, not a diplomatic one. Fear is just your body telling you to pay attention. She said, I am paying attention. That night Talvin could not sleep. He lay in his quarters, staring at the stone ceiling and listening to the wind. All outside, something was wrong. He could feel it the way you feel a storm before it arrives at midnight. His scanner pinned a small alert buried in the routine data. One of the Drenvak junior officers, a young male named Voss, had been transmitting coded signals off-world. The signals were encrypted in a format Talvin did not recognize, but the direction was clear. They were being sent to someone outside the system. He ran to Mara and told her. She was already awake, sitting in the dark with her eyes open, like she had been waiting for him. She listened, and then she said something that made his blood run cold. This is not about the summit, Talvin. Someone paid for those signals. Someone does not want peace. Someone wants both sides dead, and they are sending someone to finish the job. How do you know? He asked, because she said, and her eyes caught the dim light in a way that made them look like something ancient and patient and very, very dangerous. This is what humans do. We see the pattern before it arrives. She stood and walked to the window. The storm outside was getting worse. Lightning split the sky over the dead plains of Orth Prime. They are coming, she said. They are already on their way. Talvin looked at his scanner. Mara's heart rate was still 58 beats per minute. It had not changed all day. The alarm woke everyone at once. It was not the soft chime of a routine alert. It was the deep howling scream of a proximity breach. The kind of sound that meant something had dropped out of faster-than-light travel far too close to the planet's surface. The kind of sound that meant someone was not here to talk. Talvin was on his feet before his mind fully woke. His scanner was already flooding with data. An unmarked ship in low orbit. Military-grade engines, weapon systems hot. No identification signal. No diplomatic codes. Nothing but silence and intent. The ship deployed its cargo. 12 drop pods falling through the storm like burning seeds. They hit the ground in a wide ring around the citadel, and the shock waves rattled dust from the ancient stone walls. Mercenary Estanville recognized the energy signatures. The Syndicate of Hollow Sun. A black market war guild that sold chaos to the highest bidder. They did not take sides. They took money, and someone had paid them very well to come to Arth Prime tonight. He ran through the corridors, shouting orders, but his voice sounded thin and useless against the howl of the storm and the growing thunder of armored boots outside. The Korvathi guards were diplomats, not soldiers. They carried ceremonial sidearms, and their hands shook as they tried to form a defensive line. The Drenvak were warriors, but they had been separated from their heavy weapons as part of the summit security agreement. They had only their natural armor and their fists. Keshran was roaring orders at his officers, but even he looked unsettled. The syndicate did not send 12 pods for a small job. This was an extermination team. Talvin found Mara in the central hall. She was standing perfectly still while everyone around her was running and shouting and panicking. She was looking at the floor. No, she was looking at the layout of the citadel. She had memorized the architectural files during the 6-day journey, and now she was seeing the building in her mind, every corridor, every room, every choke point, every weakness. She looked up and her eyes were different. Alvin had seen calm and he had seen cold, but this was something else. This was the look of a machine that had just been switched on. Something behind her brown eyes had shifted like a gear, clicking into place, and what stared out at him now was not the quiet woman who drank coffee and read poetry. It was something older. Commander, she said, and her voice carried across the chaos without rising in volume. Block the east corridor with the Korvathi guards, 3 ranks deep. They do not need to fight. They just need to hold for 4 minutes. He opened his mouth to argue, but she was already turning to Keshran. World, take your 6 strongest and go to the west gallery. There is a maintenance shaft behind the 3rd pillar. It leads to the roof. They will try to breach from above. Stop them. Keshran stared at her for 1 heartbeat. Then he bared his teeth in what Talvin realized was a grin, and he moved his warriors followed without question. Mara directed everyone. She placed the remaining Drenvak at the main gate. She sent 2 Korvathi technicians to reroute the citadel ancient power grid into the external doors to create an electromagnetic seal. She positioned herself at the center of the inner hall, where all corridors converged. She became the heart of the defense, and every beat pumped purpose into the people around her. Alvin stayed near her because he did not know where else to go. His scanner was still running, still tracking every life sign in the building, still doing its quiet, invisible job of assessing threats, and then it did something it had never done before. It started with Mara heart rate. It rose from 58 to 72. Not a spike, a controlled climb, like someone turning up the power on a reactor. Her adrenaline levels surged, but they did not flood her system the way they would in a Korvathi or a Drenvak. Instead, they flowed in precise measured waves like her body was dosing itself. Her muscle density readings changed. Her fascia tightened. Her bone density seemed to increase slightly, as if her skeleton was bracing itself from the inside. Her pupils dilated, but her focus sharpened. Her reaction time dropped from 0.3 seconds to 0.1. The scanner tried to classify her. It had a database of every known species in the galactic registry and a threat assessment algorithm that could evaluate a being combat potential in milliseconds. It cycled through the classifications. Class 2 adaptive endurance species. That was the official human designation. It tried that first, then it rejected it. The readings did not match. It moved up class 3, class 4, class 5. It kept climbing, and it kept failing because the numbers would not stop changing. Mara's body was not static. It was adapting in real time, reclassifying itself moment by moment, becoming something more with every second that passed. The scanner threw an error, not a minor one, not a data conflict or a calibration warning. It screamed. The sound pierced Talvin's ear and he flinched. The display behind his eye flooded red, and a message appeared that he had never seen in 23 years of service. Danger. Unclassifiable threat ceiling cannot be determined. He stared at Mara. She was standing in the center of the hall with her feet apart and her hands open at her sides. She was breathing slowly and steadily, and her eyes were moving, tracking something he could not see. First explosion hit the main gate. The electromagnetic seal held for 3 seconds, then failed. The ancient doors buckled inward, and through the smoke and dust and howling wind came the mercenaries. They were a mixed-species kill team Garth shock troopers in powered armor Veltian infiltrators. With cloaking fields, 2 Drenvak traders who had sold their honor for money. And at the front, a massive Garth carrying a warhammer that crackled with energy. Its head was the size of Mara's entire torso. They poured into the hall, and the fighting erupted everywhere at once, energy bolts and blades and screaming and the wet, horrible sound of impact. The Garth leader charged straight through the chaos, heading for Keshron, who had just descended from the roof with blood on his claws. The warlord turned, but he was too slow. His flank was exposed, and the Garth raised the warhammer in a two-handed grip and swung it directly at Keshron's unprotected head. The strike was fast and brutal and absolutely lethal, and Mara Mother Talvine's scanner registered her movement at 11 meters per second, faster than any human he had ever seen recorded in any database. She crossed the distance in 4 strides, and she did not dodge, and she did not deflect. She stepped into the arc of the hammer, and she caught it with one hand. The hall went silent, not quiet silent. The kind of silence that falls when the universe itself stops to watch. The Garth shock trooper was 300 kilograms of armored muscle and engineered fury. The warhammer in his hands was designed to crack starship hulls. Its power cell was fully charged, and the swing had been aimed to kill with everything behind it. Mara's left hand was wrapped around the haft of the hammer, and the hammer was not moving her feet or planted on the stone floor. Her legs were bent slightly, and her entire body was locked into a position that seemed impossible for something her size. Her arm was shaking, not from weakness, but from the sheer physics of what she was doing. Every muscle in her body was engaged. Talvine could see the tendons standing out on her neck like cables. His scanner was going insane. Her body was doing something that the machine could barely process. Her skeletal system was redistributing the force of the impact across every bone. From her wrist to her shoulder to her spine to her legs to the stone beneath her feet. Her muscles were firing in patterns that no Korvathi or Drenvak body could replicate. Dozens of muscle groups working together in perfect synchronized opposition. Her metabolism had spiked to a level that would have killed most species in minutes, burning through energy reserves at a rate that turned her body into a furnace. She was not supposed to be able to do this. The Garth stared at her. His black eyes were wide behind his visor. He pushed harder. The hammer trembled, but did not move. Mara held, and her eyes locked onto his, and what he saw in them made him do something Talvine had never seen a Garth do. He hesitated. 3 seconds. That is how long. She held 3 seconds that felt like 3 years, and then she moved. She twisted her wrist, and her grip shifted, and the hammer turned in her hand, not with strength, but with technique. She redirected the Garth's own force back into the weapon and tore it from his grip with a sound like metal screaming. She reversed the hammer in one fluid motion and drove the blunt end into the center of his chest plate. Impact sent him backward 3 meters. His armor cracked down the middle, and he hit the ground like a falling building. He did not get up. The silence broke. Everything happened at once. The Drenvak warriors who had been fighting scattered battles across the hall saw what happened, and something ignited in them. The Drenvak were a species that valued nothing more than martial excellence. Their entire civilization was built on the idea that strength and honor were the same thing, and they had just watched a creature half their size stop a killing blow with her bare hand. They roared. It was not a battle cry. It was something deeper. Something that came from the oldest part of their warrior souls, a sound of recognition. They had seen something sacred, and it set them on fire. Keshron was the first to move. He threw himself back into the fight with a ferocity that shook the walls, and his warriors followed. Every Drenvak in that hall fought like 10, because the small human woman had shown them what will look like when it lived inside flesh and bone. Mara did not stop. She dropped the hammer and moved through the battle like water through broken stone. She did not fight like a Drenvak with power and fury. She did not fight like a Korvathi with caution and calculation. She fought like a human. She used everything. She used her elbows and her knees and her forehead. She used the environment, slamming one mercenary into a pillar, kicking another down a stairwell. She used the enemies against each other, redirecting a Vulcan infiltrator energy blade into his own ally. She used fear, because after the hammer catch, every mercenary who looked at her hesitated for just a fraction of a second. A fraction of a second was all she needed. Talvin watched from behind a fallen column. His hearts were beating so fast, he thought they might burst. He had finally read the classified files, the real ones, not the summaries, and now he understood what they said. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the fastest. They were not the toughest. They did not have natural armor or claws or venom or telepathy. But they were the only species in the galactic registry that had every adaptation at once: endurance that could outlast any predator, pattern recognition that could predict enemy movement before it happened, adrenaline systems that could be controlled and directed instead of overwhelming the mind, cooperative instincts so deep that a room full of strangers could become a fighting unit in seconds, pain tolerance that allowed them to keep functioning long after their bodies should have stopped, and something else, something that no scanner could measure and no database could classify. Will this absolute unbending refusal to stop the battle ended not with a dramatic final blow, but with a slow, terrible realization spreading through the mercenary ranks. They were not winning, they were dying. And the thing in the center of the hall, the small brown-skinned creature with the swollen hand and the steady eyes, was not slowing down. They ran. The last 4 mercenaries broke and fled into the storm, and the Drenvak did not chase them because Kashran raised his fist and called his warriors back. He did not want to chase. He wanted to stand in the hall with blood on his claws and look at the human Mara. Was breathing hard now. Her left hand was purple and swollen twice its normal size. Something was probably broken inside it. Her uniform was torn, and there was blood on her face, though Talvin could not tell if it was hers. She stood in the middle of the ruined hall, surrounded by fallen enemies, and she looked tired, not defeated, just tired. The way a fire looks when it has burned through everything in its path and is settling back into embers. She took a knee and pressed her good hand against the floor and closed her eyes, and breathed. Kashran walked toward her. His massive form cast a shadow over her like a mountain over a river. He looked down at her for a long time, and his 4 amber eyes held something that Talvin had never seen. In a Drenvak, before reverence, the warlord straightened his spine. He brought his right fist to the center of his chest and extended his left arm palm open toward Mara the Kalthresh, salute given only to an equal warrior. In the entire history of the Drenvak Dominion, it had never been given to a non-Drenvakantal. Now Mara looked up at him, and despite the pain and the exhaustion, she smiled. Kashran, the warlord, who had never bowed to anyone, smiled back. Morning came to Orth Prime, the way forgiveness comes to old wounds, slowly and without announcement. The storm had broken during the night, and pale golden light spilled through the shattered windows of the citadel, touching the blood-stained stone. With something that almost looked like mercy, Mara sat on a broken pillar in the main hall. Her left hand was wrapped in a med brace that hummed softly as it worked to repair the fractures inside. Her fingers were still swollen and dark, but she held a cup of that bitter human drink in her right hand, and she sipped it like it was any other morning. Talvin watched her from across the hall and tried to understand how a person could stop a weapon that should have killed her and then sit calmly, drinking coffee 6 hours later. He could not understand it. He was beginning to think he never would. Mercenaries' communication equipment had been recovered from the bodies. Riska had spent the night decoding the encrypted signals, and what she found made Talvin sick. The Syndicate of Hollow Sun had been hired not by the Drenvak and not by any external enemy. They had been hired by a Korvathi corporate faction called the Varenthi Group, a weapons manufacturing consortium that had profited from the border war for 11 years. Peace would end their contracts. Peace would cost them billions. So they had paid to have both delegations killed and the evidence planted to make each side blame the other. The war would have continued for another decade, another 100,000 dead. Another generation of children growing up learning to hate Talvin brought the decoded files to Mara. She read them with her good hand, scrolling through the data on the pad without any change in her expression. When she finished, she set the pad down and looked at him. "You were surprised?" she said. He could not speak for a moment. Then he said yes. She shook her head gently. "I suspected an internal actor from the beginning. The pattern was too clean." Someone on your side had too much to gain from failure. "I have been gathering evidence since the first day you knew," he whispered. "I did not know," she said. "I suspected." There is a difference. Knowing is easy. Suspecting means you have to keep going without certainty. That is harder. She stood and winced as her injured hand shifted inside the brace. Then she straightened, and something in her posture changed. She was no longer the warrior of last night, and she was no longer the quiet woman who read poetry on the ship. She was something in between, something complete. "It is time to finish this," she said. Final session of the summit began an hour later. They all had been cleared of bodies and wreckage, but the scars of the battle remained in the stone, cracks in the floor, bloodstains that would not wash out, scorch marks from energy weapons. These were not cleaned, because both sides agreed without speaking that the marks should stay. They were proof of what had happened and what had almost been lost. Shran sat at the Drenvak table. His armor was dented and scratched, and he had a fresh wound across his face that he had refused to let anyone treat. He wore it openly the way Drenvak wear all honorable scars. The Korvathi delegation sat across from him, pale and shaken. Several of them could not meet Keshran's eyes because they now knew what their own people had tried to do. Mara sat between them. She did not raise her voice. She did not give speeches. She laid the decoded files on the table and let both sides read them in silence. She let the truth do what truth does when it is no longer hidden. Then she spoke. "The people who wanted this war to continue are now exposed. The question is, what do you want to build in its place?" She looked at Keshran world. "Your people died because of a broken trade agreement. That wrong has never been answered. I believe it must be answered not with blood, but with a guarantee that it can never happen again." She looked at the Korvathi delegation. "Your border is secure, but your honor is not. Your own people funded the murder of diplomats. If you want the galaxy to trust you again, you must be the ones who make this right." What followed was not quick, and it was not easy, but it was different from every negotiation that had come before, because the two sides were no longer enemies sitting across a table. They were survivors sitting in a room where they had bled together. Kryn spoke first, and his voice was rough but honest. "The dead cannot be brought back, but their names can be remembered. If the Korvathi will build a memorial on Vreth and sign a mutual protection pact that binds both our peoples, I will accept peace." The Korvathi lead diplomat looked at Talvin. Talvin looked at Mara. Mara said nothing. She just waited. The diplomat agreed. The Andris Accord was signed before the sun reached its highest point. It was not just a ceasefire. It was a mutual defense and trade agreement that bound the Korvathi and the Drenvak together in ways that would make future betrayal nearly impossible. Both sides agreed to jointly dismantle the syndicate cell that had targeted them. Both sides agreed to open their borders for trade and cultural exchange, and buried in the final clause written in Mara's careful hand was a single line: "The names of the 900 who died on Vreth shall be read aloud at the opening of every joint session for as long as this accord." And Dureskrin read that line and closed all four of his eyes and was silent for a very long time. When he opened them, they were wet, and he did not try to hide it. As the delegations prepared to leave, Talvin found Mara standing outside the citadel. The wind was still and the dust had settled, and for the first time Arth Prime looked almost peaceful. He stood beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then he asked the question that had been living inside him since the day she walked onto his shipyard. Species has only been in the galaxy for 2 centuries. How are you already? This effective, she was quiet for a moment, and she looked up at the pale sky, like she was remembering something very old and very far away. We spent 200,000 years learning how to survive everything our own world threw at us, she said. Ice ages that lasted 10,000 years, plagues that killed half of us overnight, predators that hunted us in the dark. We fought the world and we fought each other, and we kept going. The galaxy is new to us. The conflict is not. We do not want to fight. But if we have to, we have had a lot of practice. She paused, and then she said something softer, and we learned something along the way. Something that most species never figure out. What is that? That the ones who survive are not always the strongest. They are the ones who know when to stop fighting and start building. Talvin updated his personal log that night aboard the Velshara as it climbed back toward the stars. He amended Mara file. He removed the words human attaché and replaced them with human. Attaché approached with respect and caution. Riska found him on the bridge staring at the stars again. She stood beside him, and after a while she asked, "What did you learn?" He was quiet for a long time. The stars turned slowly outside the observation glass, and somewhere behind them, Orth Prime was shrinking into a point of light no different from any other. "The scanner told me she was dangerous," he said. Finally he paused. It was wrong. She's not dangerous. She is something far worse. She is kind and dangerous. And she chooses which one to baby. Velshara jumped to faster than light, and the stars stretched into lines of white, and then there was nothing but silence and the hum of the engines carrying them home. The Andris Accord held for 100 years in the Drenvak warrior halls. They carved a new proverb into the stone above the entrance to their most sacred chamber. It was written in the old language, the one reserved for truths that must never be forgotten. Beware the soft hand. It is soft because it chooses to be. And somewhere on a small blue-green world on the far side of the galaxy, a woman with a scar on her left hand poured herself a cup of coffee and watched the sun come up and smiled because the war was over, and it stayed over.